So I want you to imagine that you're a music artist uploading your content to Spotify. You've spent days, weeks, months crafting the perfect musical arrangement. And then shortly after upload, Spotify is like, wait a minute, how about we change a few of the notes here and there to give your song a bit of a more mainstream vibe? Maybe we sped up the tempo or sped up the beginning of the tracks to account for audience retention. Or what if we periodically remixed your song for evolving user tastes through time? I think as a creator, you'd be rightly pissed off, and probably as a listener as well, you probably wouldn't be all that comfortable with that. Well, there's actually nothing, technologically speaking, that's kind of stopping Spotify from doing this right now. We already have all the technology that we need, and certainly Spotify has been playing around with AI quite a lot. And the only reason why they haven't done this kind of big data driven approach is because the audience backlash to doing a thing like that would be so severe that would be committing reputational suicide on the part of Spotify. But if we as creators, as artists, as users, as listeners, if we don't actually complain and let our voices be heard about something like that, that is exactly the future of the music industry. Now, why am I opening up a video about Nvidia by talking about the music industry? Well, that's because Nvidia, with their recent announcement of DLSS 5, has just taken the first step in that direction. DLSS 5, if you've been living under a rock, is basically the equivalent of a shitty Snapchat filter that is applied on top of the rendered image of a video game, and is NVIDIA's opinion of what that game is supposed to look like. People aren't too happy. It's been quite a shit show, in fact, and it's already led to a few gold moments online, such as the team at Digital Foundry first praising the technology after the first time that they had a chance to see it.
Yes, Rich, I think this is probably the most impressive by quite a lot game demo I've seen.
And then upon seeing the audience backlash, promptly decided to backtrack themselves.
I think it would have been prudent to wait to see the reaction from the audience and the developers to the keynote.
The equivalent of cheating and then showing remorse after you've been caught. Or to Jensen Huang, NVIDIA's big boss, upon smelling the shit show that he had created, to get on stage and claim that everyone was wrong.
Well, how do you feel about that criticism?
Well, first of all, we're completely wrong.
I feel like I've heard a tone deaf comment like that before, but I don't know where exactly.
Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
Oh yeah. So I actually think this is quite dark, and I think that NVIDIA just precipitated the death of character art direction in video games. Something that had started before with MetaHuman from Unreal. MetaHuman is basically a character creator that ships with Unreal and isn't necessarily all that bad, but myself working in the games industry, it seems that MetaHuman is now used everywhere in every studio that I'm in contact with or for whom I've done a contract for or something like that. Not everyone, but let's just say that there's a lot of studios out there who are using MetaHuman right now. And it's leading to a sameness when it comes to characters because everyone is using the same rig, everyone's using the same facial rig, the same body proportions, and no one wants to do any kind of rigging anymore because of MetaHuman's rigs, you know? Everyone's kind of using that. So, I mean, so we've had character creators before. MetaHuman isn't necessarily the first one, but the ones that we had before were something like FaceGen, which kind of looked like shit. So studios, you know, were only using it here and there. I have personally used it in the past, but it's the kind of thing that we used only here and there for background NPCs or for NPCs for games for which, you know, we didn't really care all that much what the character actually looked like. You know, I mean, take something like Dark Souls. I mean, there was a character creator at the beginning of it, which is FaceGen. You could spend time to customize your character as much as you want, and then what happened? You played the rest of the game as an undead. That's basically From Software saying that, yeah, you know, we got character customization in the game, but it looks like shit, so we're just going to replace it with a model that looks better for most of the game. So character art direction has kind of already been going down the drain for a while, and with NVIDIA's announcement, things are simply going to speed up now. Because now everything will look hyper-realistic, will look like NVIDIA's version of what your characters are supposed to look like. Now, just to be the devil's advocate here when it comes to MetaHuman, as AAA game budgets have kind of been ballooning over the past few years, the revenue side of things hasn't really been keeping up. So we've kind of reached a point in the games industry where game development budgets are way too big for most AAA games. And so something has to change here. And something like MetaHuman is actually, believe it or not, kind of a bit of a solution to that, where we can still have pretty good looking characters overall, but all the while helping to reduce the production budget, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's led to a few really amazing games like Clair Obscur, which was a fantastic game of last year. Absolutely amazing game. I've loved playing it. And, you know, I don't necessarily think Clair Obscur would actually exist as a game if it wasn't for Unreal 5 and if it wasn't for something like MetaHuman. So I'm not necessarily saying that technologies like MetaHuman are always bad and that we should never use them. They certainly have their place. They are partly an answer to the economics issue that a lot of video game studios have been having because of ballooning budgets and stagnant revenue increases. But like it or not, it leads to sameness. The moment that every game starts to use the same rigs, the same body proportions, the same face generator, the same kind of hair, then suddenly every game starts to look the same. And this is kind of where we are right now in the AAA gaming industry. And Nvidia is just about to make things a lot worse. One of the biggest issues with using off-the-shelf characters or character assets, not even just rigging, but also in terms of clothing, these sorts of things, is that it's very easy to make characters look completely out of place. If you remember Final Fantasy VII Remake, there was a lot of talk when the game came out about the NPCs, where you have the main characters, which look great. They feel really nice in the context in which they are. And then you have all these generic looking ass NPCs. They're just out of the modern day world. They're completely out of place. And they're all generic fab assets. They're all prefabricated characters. And the developers just integrated that in there, thinking that people would never really kind of notice or pay attention or care about that. This is where we're going. This is what's going to happen more and more. Your character art direction is now signed Nvidia. So I've been taking a look at their technology for a while, and there's actually a few good things I wanted to point out. And let me just take a look at my notes first, see what I wrote down here. And actually one good thing. There's actually only one good thing in my notes. There's a few things that it does well. When you look at some of these images here, especially when there's environment showing in these sorts of things, you know, like there's certainly improvements when it comes to ambient occlusion and shadows and these sorts of things, but I'm kind of reluctant to say that that's actually a good thing, and we'll get to that later. I don't want to jump ahead too much, but the only thing that I think is actually a plus of what I have seen so far is the hair shading. So hair shading is actually a huge challenge when it comes to video games. You have a shader that is running for the hair. It's a very specialized shader. It costs a lot. And you also have another shader for faces, which is also an ultra specialized shader, which costs a lot. It's actually quite common in video games that both the hair shader and the skin shader will actually respond to completely different lights in the environment. One may support dynamic lights, the other one might not. They might have a completely different technology when it comes to shadows. And then on top of that, when it comes to hair, you also have to deal with transparency. Deferred renders like Unreal or pretty much any other modern renderers that we have, the deferred nature of it, because everything is kind of rendered in different passes, does not deal very well with transparency. Having semi-transparent objects is extremely, extremely hard. And we have to rely on things like using a bit of a screen door effect because it's the best that we can do for transparency's sake. I think this looks pretty good when it comes to hair shading and the transition and the soft kind of shadows that are being casted here. You know, you can see how here in Starfield you have these extremely harsh transitions. And the only way that we can sort of fix that in games is by doing very careful texture blending. So on the character's scalp, you know, we might actually, within the albedo information, within the albedo texture, we might actually kind of start to draw a few hairs in there to sort of hide that harsh transition from skin to hair. You know, there's a few kind of tricks that we can do like that, but you can't easily do that if the haircuts are made to be easily swapped between characters. So I actually kind of appreciate that. I like what it's doing here for hair rendering. Also, like if we look back at the images of Grace from Resident Evil, it's kind of the same thing. You can also see in there. If you kind of look at the hair, you know, like the lighting on the hair, like there's this kind of like huge sort of backlight that seems to be here or something, but you're not really seeing that on the rest of the character. That's because the hair shader is probably reacting to entirely different lights in the environment, or it's not reacting to the same set of lights, or the shadows on it are completely different versus what's happening on the face, you know? So you kind of have this situation where the rendering of the hair doesn't really match the rendering of the skin or the rest of the environment. You know, it's very common. So, you know, like kind of thinking about this technology, looking at this kind of thing, for me, this is the only thing that I'm like, that's a plus. Like, I can't really complain about that. Everything else I have about this technology are complaints. So, okay, so what are the concerning things, Laura? There's actually quite a few. So let's go through this list together. So first of all, this technology is upgrading the faces. It's kind of reimagining the faces, but it's reimagining the faces based upon what Nvidia thinks a realistic, more appealing version of the character is supposed to look like, right? And in doing so, it's also changing the morphology of faces. So Nvidia claims that this technology doesn't actually change the geometry. It basically only changes the lighting. But obviously, the moment that you start paying attention to what the technology is actually doing, you can see that this really is just a shitty Snapchat filter that's applied on top of the image. It's not just improving the lighting the way that it's doing in certain places with the ambient occlusion pass. It's completely changing the character's face and making them look like someone else entirely. And it's actually quite obvious if you go frame by frame at this particular image, what is actually going on there. Look at her lips, basically. Like, you can actually see how her lips are becoming fuller. Her eyes are actually becoming bigger. If you look at this particular eye, if you look at where it actually is, you can see that, like, it's even kind of moved here, yeah? It's completely changing the morphology. If you look at what's happening under the eyes themselves, you can see, like, it's completely changing the structure of the face. And that's actually really bad. Why? Because, well, first of all, it's not the face the way that it was imagined by the developers. It's also not consistent across different shots. The technology here can't actually change the face that much because, well, it's a close-up, right? So it's not going to change the face as much as it is in the other circumstance. But the AI itself is actually kind of changing the way that she looks, only by virtue right now of the distance of the character on screen. I have no idea what this would actually look like if the character was actually starting from really far and then walking and then coming further towards the camera. I have a feeling that this technology is actually going to give you like 3 or 4 different versions of the same face. Like when it's much further, it's going to imagine that the character looks like someone else. And then as the character gets closer, then it's going to look more and more like what the artist actually imagined the character to be, you know? So like this is going to be kind of interesting to see what this technology looks like in the future because of that. But this is the part that I find very concerning. Also, in the context of, you know, where is this character supposed to be? Like, this AI has no idea what is the context of this particular character at this particular moment. And not having played the game, but having heard people talk about it, it seems that she's kind of going like someone close to her has died or something like that. I don't know. No spoilers. I don't even know what the story of the game is yet, right? But she's probably not in a situation where she wants to be all beautied up and all like pretty and stuff like that, right? This might not really be a great time for her, and maybe she actually wants to look like fucking depressed. And Nvidia is like, fuck that. She's gonna look pretty because that's what we think the audience wants. We just want to go for the most mainstream look ever to like everything everywhere, right? So that's a big problem, you know, like creatively speaking, from the perspective of the developers, they've just been robbed of their own agency into what the character is actually supposed to look like at that moment by an AI that has no idea what is the context of the character and only cares about beautifying it based upon its own training data that it has at that moment. So I find that really, really problematic. This is Nvidia now saying that the characters in the game that you play, and the game that you buy, and the game that you develop will look like what they think the characters are supposed to look like. Their model that they're using here has been trained on a data set that we don't know what's in there. We have no idea what is actually in there. Now, every character that's going to use this particular technology is going to look like just another character or just another reference picture out of that particular data set that they have used. You know, I'm not going to lie. A lot of the improvements that we're seeing for this particular phase that this technology is actually doing, a lot of the improvements themselves, we don't actually need AI to be able to do these things, you know? I hate to sort of throw shade at another character artist's work, but it is true that her face does look a little bit bland in this particular case, or rather look a little bit flat, right? There's not all that much happening. So the technology is adding more details. It is sort of adding a little bit more specular. It's making the volumes pop a little bit more, but I'm not actually sure that we need AI to be able to do that, because like if I was actually working on that production team and I was part of the reviewing the character in that particular context, in that particular shot, I probably would point out that maybe we want to maybe have, you know, a front light or something else that's kind of bringing out a little bit more of the volumes and the face of the character. And this is something that developers could have improved themselves to begin with. We don't necessarily need an AI to be able to do something like this. So if you decided, like some developers do, that we want to be somewhere on the realism spectrum, but we're not actually trying to make our characters look naturalistic, that's not actually what we're kind of going for, this AI is going to just add that sort of realism slop filter on top of the work that you have done. And so this kind of like character right here, like just look at this, you know, like this is like fucking Mid-Journey shit or like something. This is really, really terrible, you know? It's like, what's kind of going on there? By God, if you're trying to have, you know, your own unique art style, now NVIDIA's just going to shit over all of that. I don't trust NVIDIA's claim that artists are going to have full control over this technology. I mean, if this code runs after the frames of your own video games have been generated, then how hard can it be for NVIDIA to update their model at some point in the future? Now, suddenly you'll be downloading updates straight from NVIDIA that will be changing the look of the characters, and that will be completely without the input of the creative team. We don't know that that is what will happen. This is just speculation at this point, but it could happen. NVIDIA just opened that door. You know, what stops them from updating the model in the future and then just changing completely the look of the characters based upon what they think at that moment the characters should look like? What is people's taste at that point in time? NVIDIA does claim right now that the technology doesn't change the geometry, but I think that word at that point is kind of meaningless because this is basically, you know, a filter that's applied on top of the image. So we're not really talking about geometry at that point. We're just talking about pixels, right? And it is kind of, as we've seen, kind of moving some of the pixels around. It is changing some of the facial features that we have seen. So it's only a matter of time before NVIDIA is making even more creative decisions like, oh, well, you know, maybe like we think that the eyes of the characters, to make them more appealing, should look always a little bit bigger. Maybe, you know, we should feminize faces of our female characters a little bit more. So this is actually quite funny. NVIDIA said that we retain full control. We can adjust contrast and saturation. Everything is fine. I hear you like filters. So we're allowing you the chance to put a filter on top of our filter that's on top of your image. Some of the other limitations that this technology addresses, like ambient occlusion, if we take a look at shots of environments or these sorts of things, you can see that there's a lot more ambient occlusion within the environments themselves. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but do we really need a neural network to be able to do that? You know, you could also just give us better GPUs and would be able to get to the same place. It's not like us 3D artists haven't been doing really awesome renders of our characters for a long time. We know how to do great looking characters. The reason why we're not doing better looking characters, at least from a shadow standpoint and a shading standpoint, in games is often just because of console limitations. So give us better GPUs and we'll be able to get that better lighting within the scene, better lighting going on people's faces. We'll be able to do that by virtue of having better GPUs. But we won't be able to get there because NVIDIA is spending all of their R&D on AI, thereby guaranteeing that the only way that we will be able to get better lighting and better rendering is by using DLSS. In preparation of this video, I actually gave some thoughts to what would be an ethical take on this technology. So there's really two issues here, right? Is that, first of all, it makes all the characters everywhere kind of look the same because it's kind of trained on realistic looking data. And in doing so, it's erasing the creative intent of the team behind the work. I could see a technology like this that is developed in such a way that the technology itself doesn't actually do anything until you as a developer feed it your own training data. We could actually create characters for video games, spend a lot of time sculpting the faces, sculpting what the character is going to look like, and then generate a series of renders of every angle, different lighting conditions, have a turntable of basically lights that are sort of running around the character, have cameras that's also capturing the look of our virtual characters from every different angle, just like we're doing in the case of photogrammetry, but do that virtually for our virtual characters, and then use that as the training data behind the technology itself, such that when you're actually playing a game afterward, and this technology is applied on top of the faces, it's not actually replacing the face with whatever, the model itself was kind of trained on, but it's actually only using the data of that particular character, the best looking renders of that character that the art team generated. It's only using that to basically address the limitations of the real-time renderer. So then, as a creative team, as an artist, you retain full control over the art direction. You retain full control over the data that is used. You know that the data will never look like something else, ever. And you retain full ownership over what your characters will look like in the end. I could see something like that actually working. Now, this is all, obviously a lot of what I've been talking in this video is complete speculation, right? This is just the beginning. We don't know where this is actually going to go. To do something like that, we would have to depend on thousands of data points that have been generated, perhaps even for one character here. But Nvidia could actually supply the tools to be able to do that. Nvidia could supply lighting rigs, lighting setups. Nvidia could even create a scene within Unreal in which you actually drop your character, and then there's a turntable that captures character's head from every different angle. Like, something like this is possible. Nvidia could actually supply the tools and supply the technology to do something like this in an ethical way. But that's probably never going to happen, ever. And let's face it, it's not only on Nvidia at that point, it's also on the developers. Let's face it, from the point of view of a developer, something like that is a lot more involved. And although some developers would be interested to go down that path to maximize the impact of the artistic vision of their team, a lot of studios would not. I can promise you that there is a lot of studios that are simply going to default to using the Nvidia face slot filter on top of the characters, and they're going to care less and less about the artistic expression of the characters that goes within their video game, because it's cheaper. So the future for art direction in games is very dark. Or not, because Nvidia is just going to slap a rim light on top of that shit.